But first, more than 2.5 million men and women have served in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The health challenges many veterans face when they return home, such as post-traumatic stress disorder or traumatic brain injury, are well documented. But there's another illness many military personnel suffer from that's led to a fight among doctors over how to diagnose the condition. Some doubt it even exists. Nick Schifrin returns now with this story, produced and reported by the NewsHour's Dan Segalin.
There it comes.
On the edge of a U.S. base in Kuwait, the entire horizons become a cloud of dust.
That's just insane.
It's 2011. U.S. service members have been stationed in the desert for 8 years. And in a matter of seconds, what was once a blue sky becomes thick yellow dust, and then red, and then darkness.
Now we can't see any of it.
Sandstorms like this were routine, not only in Kuwait, but theater-wide in Iraq and Afghanistan. So were thick black clouds of smoke.
Luckily, the wind's not blowing our way.
The military used burn pits to dispose of pretty much everything, from tires to batteries to styrofoam, all burned near where soldiers lived and where soldiers worked. The horror of car bombs produced combat dust and debris. Soldiers inhaled all that dust.
It's the end of the world, man.
All that smoke. And it may have afflicted them with higher than average rates of asthma, bronchitis, and other pulmonary disorders.
I find myself struggling when I pull into a parking lot, even at the grocery store, because I know what's going to happen. If I have to park in the back of the parking lot, by the time I get inside, I'm so winded that it's miserable for me to even do my grocery shopping.
Former Army Sergeant Cynthia Amon is one of more than 360,000 Iraq and Afghan war veterans diagnosed with lung disease and seen by the Department of Veteran Affairs. Amon's Missouri National Guard Police Company deployed to Kuwait and Iraq in 2003. She says in her year-long deployment, she suffered through dozens of sandstorms.
The only thing we had were like scarves, or things to cover our faces. So when we were out doing these missions in these small camps, a sandstorm would come up so quickly that the only thing you can do is try to cover your face. And I joke now, but it was almost like we were eating it.
Amon lives in Delaware with her husband and daughter. She leaned on her family for support while she struggled to figure out what was wrong.
It's been 1.5 years, almost 2 years of non-stop jumping through hoops and fighting, trying to get answers and get a definitive diagnosis.
Amon travels from her home in Delaware to Washington to advocate for veterans. She says at first, doctors said the problem was in her mind.
When I first started going to the VA and explaining my symptoms, automatically they were telling me it was anxiety, I was just hyperventilating. They tried to put me on antipsychotic medications, like different, mood stabilizers and things of that nature. And I was telling them, no, my shortness of breath is something physical. I know it is. It's not psychological. I'm not depressed. I'm not anxious. I want to find an answer.
So you got all those specimens, and we cut a little piece off for culture.
After dozens of medical tests, Amon got a surgical procedure like the one seen here, a lung biopsy, where doctors remove a sample of her lung. When they examined it, they realized she had constrictive bronchiolitis, a lung disease where the small airways are destroyed. It's rare among civilians, and there's no treatment or cure. The first time U.S. troops came down with constrictive bronchiolitis, it's believed they breathed in the black haze caused by a sulfur fire like this one. It spewed toxic fumes for almost a month. But the unit's doctors couldn't figure out the source of the soldiers' lung problems, so they sought out Dr. Robert Miller of Vanderbilt University.
When we started seeing service members with unexplained shortness of breath, they had already had a number of non-invasive studies. Chest x-rays, CT scans, pulmonary function tests, exercise tests. None of these tests seemed to explain their exercise limitation.
The patients were undiagnosable without lung biopsies that are expensive and invasive and carry some risk. He published his findings in the New England Journal of Medicine.
Small airways disease is known to be a stealth-like disease. It is difficult to diagnose it without a lung biopsy.
Constrictive bronchiolitis is the most common, far and away the most common thing that I see, which is a disease of the small airways.
Dr. Eileen Harris is a pulmonologist at the Jackson, Mississippi VA Medical Center. We met her at a conference attended by veterans with lung disease, including Cynthia Amon.
I think it's underdiagnosed for sure nationwide.
Dr. Harris says she has around 200 patients who have constrictive bronchiolitis.
My feeling is that constrictive bronchiolitis is very prevalent and probably second only to PTSD.
The VA's diagnosed more than 390,000 Iraq and Afghanistan veterans with PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. And they argue patients with constrictive bronchiolitis is nowhere near that number. The VA told the NewsHour they've diagnosed only 128 veterans with the condition, and that shortness of breath can be caused by other factors. That skepticism is shared by retired Army Colonel and pulmonologist Dr. Michael Morris at the Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio.
If you're a little bit heavier, you haven't exercised as much, if you've got some sleep issues, if you have reflux affecting the lungs is very hard to diagnose. All those things may play a role into your symptoms.
Big breath in and blast it.
Morris researches soldiers' respiratory health. He believes that unless non-invasive tests show problems, doctors should avoid invasive and what he calls risky lung biopsies.
There's a risk to, they have to undergo general anesthesia, there's a risk to that. There is a risk to the procedure itself. And our thought is that we should do everything non-invasively first before we proceed to a biopsy.
And he says since there's no treatment plan for constrictive bronchiolitis, biopsies serve little purpose. But Cynthia Amon says her lung biopsy eliminated so many doubts that had been plaguing her.
The biopsy has given me a definitive diagnosis and just some answers. It was funny because when I got the results, the first words out of Dr. Zimmer's mouth, just stop. I'm sorry. Literally the first words out of his mouth were, "Cindy, you're not crazy." Because for so long, after you're getting a normal pulmonary function test and you have lung specialists or doctors saying, your tests are normal, you know, we don't think anything's wrong, to hear those words of, there's definitely something wrong with your lungs was just such a relief.
But for these veterans, getting a proper diagnosis from the inhalation of dust, debris, and smoke is only a first step. The next step is to qualify for disability compensation, and doing that turns out to be a second major challenge. When Amon applied, she says the VA ignored her diagnosis and assigned her its lowest benefit rating.
They gave me a 0% because they said my pulmonary function testing is normal and I'm not using inhalers or corticosteroids every day.
Amon appealed and ultimately won. The VA rated her 100% disabled. She now gets disability compensation.
If I had to guess how many people were getting denied benefits because of this, I would say probably 80 to 90%.
Attorney Kerry Baker represents veterans struggling to obtain VA coverage. He used to lead the VA's legislative and policy staff.
Veterans are pushed through the claims process so fast. You know, VA examiners who might do an exam for orthopedic disabilities, the next one may be hearing loss, the next one may be some other type of disability. And you know, when you're a physician assistant doing that for a living, the odds of you having any real knowledge of complicated exposures, such as burn pits, it's not likely.
Dr. Miller thinks vets who lived under those dusty conditions and exhibit symptoms of constrictive bronchiolitis should qualify for compensation.
A soldier that presents with unexplained shortness of breath, with the appropriate exposures and no other complicating factors such as heart disease or asthma, and has a clear history of exercise limitation, may be a candidate for that presumptive diagnosis.
The VA disagrees. In response to the NewsHour's questions, the agency said, quote, "The evidence simply does not exist to support the presumption of service connection for constrictive bronchiolitis." And the VA also denied any problems with how it determines disability compensation.
Give me some normal breaths on the machine.
Out in Denver, researchers are trying to figure out if they can diagnose constrictive bronchiolitis without biopsies. This lung clearance index test at National Jewish Health could discover the same problems a biopsy does without the invasive procedure, but their research will take years.
Good job.
In the meantime, countless veterans exposed to airborne hazards struggle with every breath, more than 15 years after many of them deployed. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Nick Schifrin.